Hi, I'm Skinny Cheeks. In the Elder Scrolls Online, the most common way to set up as a damage dealer for PvE is to just stack everything into your main stat. So as a Magicka damage dealer, you would typically put 64 attribute points into Magicka, all Magicka glyphs on the body pieces, and then run a food with max Magicka on it. Then as a stamina focused damage dealer, pretty much the same thing, just the opposite with stamina instead of Magicka. Up until they made the change where our abilities now scale with our highest stats, our off resource stat, that is the opposite stat of the main one we're stacking into, it was kind of ignored as we would generally not be casting very many skills using that resource. Again, this is from a PvE DPS perspective. For PvP, the off resource has really always been important. But now that our abilities are hybridized, is it time that we revisit how we've been setting this up? Should we still be stacking everything into that one resource like we have always been? Well, yes, and maybe no. See, the way that the hybrid scaling works is that it looks at your highest stats, not a combination of the stats. So the higher your main stat is, the more damage that you'll deal. And that off resource will have no impact on that damage value. And so this could be any combo of these. It looks at them on an individual basis. So I could have my max Magicka higher, but then my weapon damage is higher than my spell damage, and my spell crit is higher than my weapon crit. It really doesn't matter. It's just going to take the highest of each. But looking at the Magicka damage dealer again, the traditional way of putting all of our attributes into Magicka, loading up with Magicka glyphs, and then picking a food with Magicka on it is still the route to go for the highest damage. That is to say, our skills will hit at their maximum potential when going this route. But what are the benefits of going in a different direction, and how much DPS will we lose in doing so? Well, that's really the core of what I wanted to cover in this video, and hopefully show you that there might be a few more good options for DPS than most people are currently considering. So what got me thinking about this topic? Well, I've been playing a ton of Stamina Dragonite over the last couple of patches, which I've really been enjoying. My main is an Imperial Dragonite, so hybridization really opened a lot of new doors for how I could play my character. So even as a Stamina spec, I do find myself having a lot of Magicka skills that I want to keep up. And with a small Magicka pool, it can be pretty tough, especially with some of the skills a bit heavier in their Magicka costs, like Burning Talons. Talons deals a ton of damage, but as a Stam DK, you have to be really careful with how you configure your setup when you're using it, or you'll constantly be out of Magicka. So this led me to start playing around with using the Tri-Stat food instead of the Bi-Stat food that I had normally been using. I typically go with the Bewitched Sugar Skulls, but the daily login ones are fine too. Sugar Skulls are actually not too expensive though for being a gold food, so if you are doing some of the more challenging content, it might be worth it to craft or buy up a stack of these to use for a tiny bit more stats. But what I found in making this swap was that my DPS actually went up a little bit for certain fights because I was able to squeeze in a few more casts of certain Magicka abilities. Now at first glance you would think, oh, the max stamina you're getting is lower, so your damage will be lower with Tri-Stat food over Bi-Stat food. And in a lot of situations, yes, that would be the case. However, I find myself in many situations where it is actually a DPS increase because of the possibilities in my skill choice that it opens up. And a big part of why this can work out this way is because swapping from Bi-Stat to Tri-Stat food is not a big loss in your main stat. So for the rest of this video, we'll be going over some stat comparisons between a few different possible loadouts and discussing when those might be useful. Alright, we'll stick with the scenario we just mentioned and compare our traditional Bi-Stat food setup to using Tri-Stat food instead. So all stamina glyphs on the gear and all 64 attribute points into stamina. Now I did include Minor Toughness and Warhorn, which are very commonly found in organized groups, and together those give us a 10% boost to our health, Magicka, and stamina. I wanted to include them because with those percent boosts, we are able to see the higher end of what we'd be missing out on by making some of these changes that we're going to go through. And I will have the spreadsheet used for this linked in the description if you want to see the comparisons that don't have those percent boosts in there, but overall the conclusions are pretty much the same. And I will also be including the 4% from the Undaunted passive since we have both light and medium armor equipped. And then for the effective power shown here, this is using the build editor on UESP. Essentially what this does for us is add up all of our stats, so this includes our crit chance, weapon and spell damage, max resource, and so on. And from that, they factor up a total calculated power. So this power level is what we'll be comparing with the different setups to see just how much we're losing by tweaking things a bit. And just to do a quick rundown of what I used for these comparisons, for the gear, pretty traditional build here with Reliquin and Pillar of Nirn. Honestly, that part really doesn't matter too much. We're just looking at the stat differences from changing the other parts of the build around. And I do have infused here on the jewelry because Bloodthirsty is not calculated in their effective power on the build editor. So this just gives us a bit closer to what we'd actually see averaged out in combat. And I used Dark Elf as the race. Again, doesn't really matter too much, but that is the most common option I see on a DPS. So with that out of the way, let's get into the comparisons. In swapping to the Tri-Stat food, we lose 883 health, but still over 25k here. We gain 4845 Magicka, pushing us up over 20k, and we lose 782 stamina. Overall, for our effective power, only about a 0.7% difference. And again, this difference is lower if you don't have Warhorn active, about a 0.66% difference there. I won't go through all of the non-Warhorn versions for each of these, but just know that's always a little bit lower in the amount of power that you lose than what you would see with Warhorn active. So at such a small damage loss, it is a bit easier to see here why I ran into the scenario where having more skill casts for my off resource in some situations could outweigh that very small DPS loss that we're looking at here. And looking at this from a Magicka perspective, still pretty much the same results. I just also included Inner Light in this because that will boost our max Magicka too. If you're not using Inner Light, you can just refer to the stamina chart and it's going to be about the same. But still well under 1% of a loss, even with both Warhorn and Inner Light going, and that gets you a lot of stamina to play with to make sure you have plenty for rolling and dodging and whatever stamina skills you might be using in your loadout. So looking at this here, am I trying to say go Tri-Stat food, ditch the Bi-Stat? No, I'm not at all. I'm simply showing that Tri-Stat is an option, but if you don't need that off-resource help, definitely stick with the Bi-Stat. Things don't have to be so black and white. And you might also ask, well, why not just use something like Candied Jester Coins or Crunchy Spider Skewer? And yeah, these can work too and actually give you a lot more sustainability of that off-resource, but there's no health bonus on these. So it's kind of like if you want your health and you just need a little bit of help with that off resource versus needing a lot of help with the off resource and being confident in not having any health bonus. Again, these are all valid options though. So I got this question in Discord and it's part of what prompted me to actually make this video. Do you know how much of a DPS loss BSS would be compared to traditional blue quality Bi-Stat food? Bewitched Sugar Skulls is what he's referring to there. And this is the comparison that we just went through. He said there's an end game community of players on PSNA that loves to endlessly make fun of BSS DPS users. It's really unfortunate that the people who don't know what they're talking about seem to often be the loudest and most insistent that they do. Instead of being flexible and open-minded, they shut down the conversation and in this case actually make fun of people who aren't doing what they think everyone should be doing. I just get really tired of reading stuff like this. The fact that people would try and meme something like Bewitched Sugar Skulls when it can actually be a really nice option, it's just kind of absurd to be honest. So come on, let's all be better than that. But moving on to some other setups, looking into Tri-Stat food got me also thinking about other Tri-Stat options. So I wanted to take a look at our glyphs. The prismatic defense glyphs only give half of the amount of whatever main stat that you would normally have been going with. So instead of 868 max stamina from a single stat glyph, you'd get 434 max stamina. But in return, you get half of a regular glyph's value of max Magicka and health as well. So really the theme so far is that in these Tri-Stat options, you are giving something up, but you're getting back a good bit more in return. And really that's just the design goal of these Tri-Stat options. So let's compare that first setup again here with prismatic glyphs instead of the traditional stamina glyphs. We end up with over 29k health, 18k Magicka, and we do lose 2287 stamina from what we would normally have. So the DPS loss here is a bit higher than just swapping to Tri-Stat food, up to around 2% this time. The big difference in going this route versus using Tri-Stat food is that we don't gain as much Magicka as we would with the Tri-Stat food, but instead we end up a bit tankier with that higher health pool. And I'll keep coming back to this because I want to be clear with my intent for this video, but if you don't need that extra health, even though it is only 2% or so power lost, you are essentially wasting that power for nothing. So definitely something to consider there. But on the other hand, let's say you do want to play things a little bit safer and you could benefit from a tiny bit more of that off resource as well, doing 98k DPS instead of 100k or 49k DPS instead of 50k, maybe that's worth it to you to trade off. Another side benefit is that you could now use the gear on both Magicka and Stamina specs without having to swap glyphs back and forth. The Hakejos used to make the glyphs are pretty expensive though, so this option might be out of the question as a newer player, but I just wanted to show the percent differences here. However, if you're really just after the off resource and not the health, this is probably not the best route for you to go. And then for the Magicka side of things, pretty similar again, about a 2.2% DPS loss here if we are running Inner Light also, but would still be about the same 2% as it is on Stamina if we're not. So not only would this give us a lot of health, but a nice Stamina pool to deal with mechanics as well. Ultimately, it's up to you. I could definitely see this as a very nice option though for doing hard mode dungeons or dungeon trifectas. And then finally, this next setup D, has both the prismatic glyphs and the tri-stat food. This is probably a bit overkill to go with both. Almost 25k stamina here probably isn't necessary, but still only a 3% power loss overall with this compared to that traditional loadout. And on the stamina side of things, pretty much the same, under a 3% damage loss and a boatload of health and magicka to work with. It definitely feels like overall the community has over-exaggerated the downside to doing something like this with your build. I mean, it's less of a difference than playing a suboptimal race option, and I see people getting good results doing that all the time. If you aren't having any issues with your health or your off resource, absolutely stick with your traditional options. No need to change what isn't broken, but if you do need some tweaks to make your setup work better, don't let the lemmings tell you that the tri-stat food or prismatic glyphs are bad. The math just does not back that up. One thing I do want to mention though is that I do think 64 points into your main attribute is still definitely the way to go for pretty much all PvE DPS scenarios. The big upside to the tri-stat food and the glyphs is that you only give up a portion of your main stat to get back a lot in return. Whereas with the attributes, you're making a straight trade of one for the other. So doing something like 32 into Magicka and 32 into Stamina, it's just not an efficient way to use your resources in the same way that the tri-stat options are. And then the last comparisons I want to make here in this video are with the recovery foods. Sometimes you just can't quite cut it without using something like Lava Foot or Ghastly Eyeball. So comparing Lava Foot to your standard bi-stat food, really the key difference here is that massive loss of health. 6150 less health here, but in return you get a ton of extra sustain, especially if you're wearing medium armor. So after the percent boost, we're looking at over 800 more recovery, but the damage output is identical to the bi-stat option. So really the choice between these has always been, do I need the sustain or do I need the health bonus? Now, one thing we could do here to kind of play around in the middle is to run prismatic glyphs with the Lava Foot food. So how does that compare? We get 2500 more health, 2282 more magicka, 2287 less stamina, and then our stamina recovery is still the same. So overall, just like with the previous prismatic glyph example, it's about a 2% loss. So it's really up to you if having that extra little bit of health and magicka tacked on might be worth it to you there. Now you might ask, why not just run Dubious Camoran Throne or Artaeum Takeaway Broth if you want that extra health and the recovery? And you absolutely could. So let's compare that setup back to our original one with the bi-stat food. Here we give up about 2300 health, the magicka is the same, and we give up about 2100 stamina, and in return we get about 558 stamina recovery after percent boosts. Overall, around a 2% power loss compared to the bi-stat food. I do find it kind of funny that people will gladly swap over to setups like this, but then for some reason are making fun of people using Bewitched Sugar Skulls, which is a much smaller damage loss. But anyways, so let's compare this common recovery food to using Lava Foot with prismatic glyphs. Back to that question of why not just use the recovery food that already has the health bonus? Well, comparing the numbers here, I think that would just come down to preference. The damage is almost identical at just 0.15%. That's way too small to actually be able to perceive in combat. So you'd get a little more health here than with the prismatic plus Lava Foot setup, about 1285 extra, but 2282 less magicka, and then you'd get 171 more stamina. Again, that won't be a perceivable difference, but you do get 256 less stamina recovery. So I think you could argue a case for both types of setups. If you value the health pool being slightly higher, then Artaeum Takeaway looks a bit better here, but if you want a bit more recovery and a bit higher off resource pool, then Lava Foot with prismatic glyphs could work too. For the sake of time, I won't go through this all again for Magicka, but the same principles would apply when comparing Ghastly Eyeball to Witch Mothers or Clockwork Citrus. So overall, we had a lot of different options here and we went through a lot of different setups. So I wanted to summarize the discussion. Hopefully it will make more sense on when you might want to use what. So first off, keep your attributes all into Magicka or Stamina, whichever route you're going. I don't really see a good reason to break from going all in there. Second, if you've been using Bystat and you wish you had a bit more of your off resource pool to work with, Bewitched Sugar Skulls or any other Tri-Stat food are absolutely a good option to go with. Still a nice amount of health and only lose a small bit of your main resource. If you're really struggling for that off resource sustain, you can go with Crunchy Spider Skewer or Candy Jester coins. You do lose the health bonus though. Point number 3, if you really like the idea of bumping up both your health and your off resource pool, prismatic glyphs are absolutely a viable option. You do give up somewhere around 2% damage, but that's up to you if that trade-off is worth it. And this works with both Bystat food, Tri-Stat food, and recovery food. And then finally, if you haven't had any trouble with your off resource and you haven't felt like you are too squishy, well, just keep doing what you're doing, because going all in on your main stat is still going to technically give you the highest DPS. But I really hope these examples help to show that it's definitely not the only option, and you do have a good bit of wiggle room to tweak things and still put yourself in a position to deal great damage. Thank you so much for watching. I hope this video was helpful for you to have a better understanding of the different ways to set up your Stamina and Magicka. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask in the comments, or I'll have the Discord server linked below. You are welcome to ask there as well. But that's going to wrap up this video. Big thanks to my current Patreon supporters and YouTube members. If you'd like to help support this channel and the website, maybe consider joining one of those. And a special thanks to Nicholas, Simon, Cougars Bay and the Cougar City Guild, the Order of War Guild, Iffy, Cantankerous Cat, Shady, Blake1816, Mordecai1212, Santanico, Nalandia, Florian, Vadridi, Cha-Cha, Unemployed, and Chryseliana. Thanks again for stopping by. I'll see y'all in the next one. Bye.